Hi, welcome to the BSB Software Podcast channel. My name is Andrew Weiss, and today I'm going to show you a technique for adding column filters to your report columns in Report Studio, such as this example here. This technique comes from one of our Brightstar Partners newsletters, which you can find on our website, brightstarpartners.com. Underneath About Us, select Newsletters. And there's an archive of all of our newsletters, which include many tips and tricks and technical articles such as this one. This article comes from Ed Gonzalez in our June newsletter, and Ed shows us how to add these column filters to reports using jQuery and JavaScript with HTML items in Report Studio. And what Ed shows us is how to take this JavaScript, which is located in the article down here, and add it to an HTML item, and how that will add a combo box or a filter to the first column of your report. Now for the podcast, I want to build on this in two ways. First, I wanted to extend the script that Ed wrote so that it adds a combo box for a filter for each column in the report. This way you have that true data filter functionality that you get in Excel. And second, I wanted to add this technique into the toolbox in Report Studio. This way other authors can use this technique as well, and I can continue to use it on other reports without having to remember what that JavaScript is, where it is, and how to do it. There are 3 files that ship with this podcast, and they are located just above the video, which is the link there to download the files associated with the podcast. And if you're watching this podcast on YouTube or our iTunes channel, you'll have to come out to our website, bsbsoftware.com/podcasts, log in or register for a free account, and then log in, and you can download these files, and you'll be on your way. The first 2 files, toolbox.xml and toolboxcontrols.xml, are Cognos files that drive the creation and the items in the toolbox. I don't intend for you to replace your files with the ones in this podcast. Use these as a template to copy and paste from. That's because I'm using Cognos 10.1 and you may be using a different version. The file may be different, or you may have customizations in yours and you don't want to remove those and blow them away. The third file is filterscript.htm, and this is the HTML code that you'll copy and paste into an HTML item if you choose to go that route, which will add the filter functionality to all of your column headers. So we're going to start with that. Just use this code right in an HTML item. So let's copy it. And then we'll go to the next step, which is to add it to the toolbox so it's more reusable and we don't have to copy and paste anymore. So let's head on over to Report Studio. And let's remove this. So what I have is a very simple list report built off the Go Sales query package, and this list has several columns of data. I've turned off pagination so that I have all of the data in the data set, and that'll be important for the filtering to actually work. I've got a use case here where I want to look for black sunglasses that I'm wearing that are from the Extreme brand. I want to know what the name of that product is and how much it cost. So today I would need a search and select prompt, or go to column filtering in Excel, or use IE's filtering. But this is a very good use case for our technique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag an HTML item onto our report. I'm going to put it beneath the list, and I'll paste our code in there. We want it beneath the list, that way that our code executes after the list is done rendering. Other than that, it doesn't matter where after the list, just as long as it's after. Now when we run the report, that code will find the list object, it'll iterate through all of the rows, and it'll create combo boxes at the top with a unique list of all of the data items that show up. Right? So we can filter down to mountaineering equipment, climbing accessories, and so on further. Now let's try our use case, which was I'm wearing black sunglasses. So we'll pick black, that are the Extreme brand, and they are eyewear. And we can see that that is the Polar Extreme sunglasses, and they are $72.50. So very simple technique, and very simple to add this code right into an existing report as an HTML item. The way that the code is written, it will find your list dynamically, and it'll add headers for each of the columns, whether it makes sense or not. So we don't have to name our list a specific name, and we don't have to wrap it around, wrap any HTML items around it, or any of those techniques that we've had to do in the past. Okay, so if that's all you want to do, then we're done. But what I would like to do is go a step further and add this as an item in our toolbox here, such as I have here. This way, other authors can take advantage of this, and again, I don't have to remember what that code is. I can just drag it in from the toolbox. So as you can see here, I have this in the toolbox. It's called Dynamic Column Filters, and it drag and drops an HTML item. So the toolbox is completely customizable, these XML files, and we are going to customize it. We're going to add a new one called podcast item. And what it's going to do is it's going to drag and drop an HTML item in that says hello world. So let's go ahead and create that. So we'll create a script that says alert, oops, hello world. Oops. And we'll close our script tag. Great. And when I run the report, it should say hello world. Great. Okay, so now what I want to do is make this a toolbox item. So let's get started by working on that toolbox.xml file. So I'll show you how I implemented the column filters by implementing this toolbox, this hello world toolbox. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of one of the other list items that show up in this file. As you look through this file, what you'll recognize is that it's a list of all the controls in the toolbox in the order that they show up. So there's a lot of customization we can do here. Right, we can add things, we can remove things, we can create new ones, reorder them. So for example, if you don't want your authors using repeater tables and repeaters, we can simply comment those out. If you have something that's at the bottom of the list you use very often, you can move it to the top. So I'm going to create a new one, and let's go through the steps here. The control ref, we'll call that podcast item. And the control ref is a cross-reference to an object that's going to be in our controls file. So we'll see that in a minute. We're going to put this in category A, which according to IBM's comments here, that is the basic category, because you can filter what shows up in the toolbox. And then we need to provide a label and a tooltip. Notice that this is called IDS label and IDS tooltip. Those are the localized versions of label and tooltip, so you can provide a variable to look up in a language file. But I don't want to do that. I'm just going to put in some hard-coded text. So I have to change them to label and tooltip with a lowercase l and a lowercase t. So the label will be podcast example. And for the tooltip, we're going to say adds hello world to the report. And finally, we can specify an icon for the image of this toolbox item. You can add an image into your images folder, or you can grab one of the existing ones from another toolbox item. Like for example, I'll grab createtuple.gif because I think that looks cool and it makes sense. Alright, so we'll save that. And we'll head over to our toolbox controls file to see what happens when we use this object. Alright, so the toolbox.xml drives the list of objects, and the toolbox controls file is the content of that object that toolbox item represents. So in here we can see many other controls that exist, and for example, let's look at query. So when you drag and drop query from the toolbox, it drops this query node with some other nodes underneath it. I've also added one at the top here that when you drag and drop the column filters item, it drag and drops this fairly large HTML item. So we're going to add ours into this report, into this XML file as well. So I'll come back over to Report Studio where we created our example, and we're going to copy this report to the clipboard. So we need to pull it out of the report specification. We're going to paste that into Notepad for a minute while we clean out everything around the HTML item that we created. And there we go. So this is the HTML item that we dragged and dropped into the report that has the JavaScript that says hello world. We'll copy and paste that into our toolbox controls file. There we go. And the final thing we need is that item, that ID, to cross-reference it to the object in the toolbox, which we called podcast item. Great. So now when we drag and drop podcast item, it drops this HTML item. And we'll save that. These two files are located on your gateway installation, and that will be in your C10 directory underneath Web Content, PAT for Report Studio, and Res for Resource. And you'll see there's a Toolbox and a Toolbox Controls XML file out there. Those two files represent the toolbox and these controls. Before making any changes to them, you'll want to make a copy to back them up just in case you make a mistake. If there's any mistakes in either of these files, Report Studio won't load. So if you're looking at a fairly unproductive progress bar, then you probably made a mistake in those files. Also, you're going to want to make another copy of them after you've done your customizations. And that's because when Cognos upgrades, it will replace those files and you'll lose all of this work. Okay, I'd like to say once you're done with these customizations, just restart the studio, but the reality is that the browser is very aggressive about caching these files. So you're going to need to clear the cache before you restart the studio. I find the easiest way to do this is to go to the Tools menu, Developer Tools, which everybody has this. It's not a specific IE installation that has it, so you can go there, or hit F12 to load it. On the Cache menu, just select Clear Browser Cache. Sometimes you can get away with clearing the cache just for this domain, but again, it's pretty aggressive, and for me it doesn't always work right. I've found that I've been banging my head against the wall fighting the browser to reload these XML files more than I've actually been fixing my bugs in the code. So if you're not seeing your changes, you're probably not doing anything wrong. It's probably the browser being pretty aggressive about its cache. Okay, so here we go in the toolbox. Now we see our podcast example, and we see our tooltip adds Hello World to the report. And if I drag and drop it in, we see we have our HTML item with our code. And this technique works for much more than just HTML items. Let's say, for example, you have a very common query calculation or a very common header, anything that you do that's common, you can put it into a report, grab it out of the clipboard, extract it from the report specification, and then put it in the toolbox as a toolbox item. And now it's not only reusable, but now it's less error prone, right? So if you're asking all of your authors to do these same 5 steps to create the same thing, it's more likely that they'll get it right if they can drag it right from the toolbox rather than have to replicate something that has many steps. So I hope you've learned a thing or two from this podcast. We've got a nice technique for showing column headers and filtering in a report, and we also have a very simple description as to how to modify that toolbox so that we can add reusable components in there. I hope that you find some of this useful and that you benefit from it. Thank you very much for your time in the podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye now.